It's terrific to have Dave Zirin with us today. Just a word, we're watching what's going on in DC at the nation, and may the human infrastructure plan move forward, because it's about justice, dental, vision, and care for millions of people. So we care a lot about that, and Zirin does too. I wanted to, as you know, I mean, in these last years, there's been an extraordinary uprising of activism in the sports world. Support of Black Lives Matter, voting rights, gender rights, the economic justice. In some ways, and this is where Dave is so great, he brings history to bear, today's movement and athlete activists stand in so many ways on the shoulders of Paul Robeson, Muhammad Ali, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, all of whom took great risks for economic, social, racial justice. And in thinking about what Dave has done, he's not only written 10 books, this is his 10th book, he not only hosts a podcast, Edge of Sports, but I think he's revived for a new generation and others, this context, this complexity of sports as an entry point for all the issues of our time, the roiling issues. And I think of Dave not simply as a great journalist, historian, speaker, and he's speaking keynote on Monday at Peace Action, New York State, but someone who's become a part of this movement while retaining his journalistic chops, but has really inspired, I think, athletes to speak their mind and to understand they have someone in Dave who understands them, their history. And so that's very important. And Dave is not just writing for the nation, you know, he's ESPN, he's a frequent guest on MSNBC. And this last book, as he shows, is bigger than one athlete. I mean, it is about profiles of courage that leap off the page, and he uncovers a whole movement of citizen athletes. One thing that really interested me in the book, and we'll talk about it, Dave, is how Trayvon Martin was such an important figure for so many of the young and not so young athletes, and how that moved to trying to find expression. Colin Kaepernick has been out of the football arena for what, 4.5 years? I still considered one of the greats. That's a whole other piece. But this book, and I turn it over to Dave, is much more than Colin Kaepernick, though very important, but it's about this movement that has arisen. And it's a movement that isn't going to go away. There's real juice in it, real power. And if you think about it, I used to do this a lot, going into an arena, if you could, or watching a game. What would connect you to other people there? Because I think there are values that do connect people. So turn it over to Dave. He was on our cruise many years ago. I laugh about this, and we announced that Dave Zirin, our sports editor, was coming. We got a lot of complaints. By the time the ship docked, people didn't want to let go of him. And he has been a regular, a great regular for many years now. And it's an honor to have him here. I look forward to what he has to say. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you so much, Katrina. Honored by the introduction, sincerely. I guess I wanted to start just because I don't know who's on this Zoom call. I don't know where people are coming from politically. I want to just first frame this about why it's so important for us to see sports with a political lens, and why politics are baked into the cake of sports. Like, you can say, I don't like politics in my sports, but that's also like saying, I don't like gravity when you fall out of an airplane. I mean, you can like or dislike it. It just is. It is a part of it. So I grew up in New York City in the 1980s. I loved sports. I was a sports obsessive. The teams of the 80s were my friends, were my colleagues, were what I looked forward to get through school. I mean, the Mets, the Knicks, oh my goodness. I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the New York Football Jets. I mean, these were, I just admitted that publicly. This was my lifeblood. And I never gave any thought to the politics of sports, or that sports even had a politics, until a basketball player named Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf in 1996 made the decision that he wasn't going to come out for the national anthem in protest of US foreign policy. And due to the fact that he started reading authors like Noam Chomsky and Arundhati Roy, And this absolutely fascinated me. Like, I'd never thought of this. And I saw on ESPN, one of the talking heads said that this basketball player, Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, must see himself in the tradition of activist athletes. And that just sent the synapses in my history major brain going off in all directions. Like, activist athletes, what the heck is this? And so I started studying it. I started studying sports history and sports sociology. And one thing absolutely leaped off the page. It was that from practically the beginning of organized sports in this country, going back 150 years, this contradiction was baked right into the cake of sports. And that's the myth of inclusion and the reality of exclusion. And I want to repeat that, the myth of inclusion and the reality of exclusion. On the one hand, sports was billed and marketed when it launched in the 19th century as the best possible expression of the United States, that anyone, if they were good enough, would be able to take the field. But on the other hand, if you were a woman, no sports for you. If you were black or brown, you were marginalized. Form your own leagues or don't play at all. But as black and brown folks, indigenous folks, and women began in the 19th century to see this form of organized sports, they began to fight for access. They immediately made it into a contested space, a space where athletes demanded access and equity and to the level of the level playing field that was promised to them. They wanted to level the unlevel playing field. So from the very beginning, this platform of sports becomes a space for more than just fun and games. It becomes this contested space, a battle between inclusion and exclusion. And through that battle, it becomes a platform for franchise owners to express their beliefs, which have often revolved not only around exclusion and color lines and gender lines and sexuality lines, but also their brand of patriotism, militarism, and corporate rule. It also almost immediately became a platform for athletes to fight not only for access to play, which has always been a part of it, but also to express dissent to the way the real world happens to operate. Not just the sports world again, but the real world. And this is why we can't think of the civil rights movement without thinking about Jackie Robinson, or the 1960s without thinking of Muhammad Ali, Tommy Smith, or John Carlos, who raised their fist on the medal stand in Mexico City, or the women's liberation movement of the 1970s without Billie Jean King. You know, a lot of people don't realize that the first Special Olympics were held in 1968. Now, that's not just a coincidence. Like, why didn't they happen in 1958? Why didn't they happen in 1948? You have to understand the political context. It came out of the struggles of the 1960s that people said that folks who are differently abled need also their own political sports space. So with a lot of differently abled folks fighting for their own self-emancipation and fighting for that space. And today, that struggle of women, of black and brown folks, of people with disabilities, has become a similar struggle for access by LGBTQ people. And it's very important to recognize, as I've written about in The Nation, that the bashing of young transgender athletes has become, along with curbing the right to vote and stopping the teaching of slavery, basically the entire platform of the GOP in this country. And of course, just as Jackie Robinson in so many ways amplifies and helps us understand the civil rights movement, today, 2021, it's impossible to imagine the movement for Black lives without thinking of that image of Colin Kaepernick first sitting and then taking that fateful knee. Now, it's worth asking why Colin Kaepernick taking that knee did have that particular resonance, especially as other athletes, particularly in the WNBA, also stood up and fought as these horrific viral videos became public of police officers effectively getting away with murder in the United States. I mean, Colin Kaepernick had a particular resonance first and foremost, and this is very obvious, was that there was a movement in the streets willing to support and connect with him. When Colin Kaepernick first sat during the anthem, and it wasn't a knee, it was sitting, he did it right after the viral videos of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile in the summer of 2016 became public. So like so many people in this country, he was expressing a very instinctive and very spontaneous frustration with the way the world was. There was no tweet sent out or press release that he was going to sit during the anthem. It came out very organically from his own sense of horror about the state of the world. And we can talk more in the discussion about how that transformed into what amounted to a 4-month demonstration by Colin Kaepernick. But the second reason why Kaepernick resonates so much is, let's be honest, the National Football League is the closest thing to a national religion that this country has. And I don't even say that glibly. Like, if you look at the top 20 rated television programs over the last 2 years, 19 of them are NFL games. And in our culture, which is so sliced and diced in terms of our entertainment, I mean, in all the different streaming channels and all the different ways that people can access distraction, the NFL is really the closest thing to a monoculture that we have left. And it's also the most, I think, prominent reproducer of patriotic ideas that we have in this country, especially at a time where so many people are disillusioned with politics. Think about ideological reproduction and think about patriotism and think about an institution that does more of that than the National Football League. And what Colin Kaepernick did by taking that knee specifically during the national anthem, which is inherently a protest between what this country promises and what it delivers. I mean, that was a direct challenge also to the patriotic ideals of the NFL. He was also, while also exercising what many would argue is the ultimate act of patriotism, which is civil disobedience. Colin Kaepernick was also thumbing his nose at the labor and racial discipline that I would argue is a prerequisite for the NFL's existence. This is a very authoritarian league, and it depends on everybody knowing their place, particularly the majority of athletes on the field who only play for 3 years on average, don't have guaranteed contracts. They put their bodies through tremendous pain and injury, and 70% of them are Black Americans, and no franchise owners are Black Americans. That is a racial contradiction that they need to keep quiet at all times, or there will be the threat of a lack of discipline. And, then if there's no discipline, then that also means that the cash register gets closed. But that's also not the only, so what he was doing was exposing the contradictions of those who play in the league and those who work in the league. But it's the gesture that's also very important. It's the taking of that knee. If Katrina and I went to a state fair or we went to the Super Bowl and we decided to take a knee together during the national anthem, people wouldn't say, gee, I wonder what they're doing. Or, oh, maybe Dave lost a contact lens. No, they would know immediately why we were taking that knee. It's a powerful, powerful gesture of nonviolent civil disobedience. And that gesture is also so brilliant. And I would argue that this is Colin Kaepernick's great gift to the movement, is that it allows for replication. And that's what my book is about. I interviewed dozens of young athletes from all over the country who took a knee. And by taking a knee, they unleashed a backlash in these different areas of the country. And the people I interviewed, it transcends red state and blue state. It transcends rural and urban. They would provoke backlashes and discussions everywhere they did this. And there's a power in taking that knee. And I learned so much by talking to them. And what I learned was truly fascinating. I learned first and foremost that for these young athletes, they didn't do it just because Colin Kaepernick did it. They were not copycats. They were not following a trend. They did it because they were affected by police violence in their own communities, or in some cases in their own families. They also did it because I would argue we've never had a generation in this country that is more demographically diverse and less tolerant of intolerance. And they are determined to write their own narrative. And that's thrilling. They are taking control of their lives in a country that they see as structurally racist. And they are aiming to change that. And that in and of itself, there's a thrill in that comes across on the page in this book. And as the athletes of this generation in Colin Kaepernick, they saw someone not so much who provided inspiration, but provided a language for protest and dissent by taking that knee. He provided like a Rosetta Stone by which they could express their own dissatisfaction. And Colin Kaepernick also demonstrated for them that the space of the athletic field was a space that could be claimed for community protest, whether it's people in the stands taking a knee, applauding the athletes, or what have you. I mean, especially high school football in small towns in this country. I mean, where there is a war against public space, the athletic field is one of the last community spaces where people gather. And nation, of course, abhors a vacuum. So this is also about sports being a place where a community comes together to have a certain kind of conversation that maybe wasn't the case 20, 30, 40 years ago when you had trade unions and Elks clubs and bowling leagues and all the things that have been hollowed out by our atomized times. And now, and I'll just end with this point, hundreds, if not thousands of athletes in this country took a knee from 2016 to 2019. And I first started this book during the pandemic last spring, and my motivation was only to call people, interview people, and make sure they didn't get forgotten, because I worry about that with history a lot of the time. Like Howard Zinn taught us that the people who make history are so often the ones who are forgotten, and we extol great individuals, often great men, without looking at the people who created the context for those folks to rise up and lead struggles. And that was why I first started. But as the summer of 2020 took place, as I was still working on the book, and we had the largest demonstrations in the history of the United States take place in all 50 states in this country after the police murder of George Floyd, I went and called all the people I'd already interviewed. And I was curious what they were up to while there were so many demonstrations. And it was remarkable that to a person, they were either organizers in the streets or they were people who were going out there to the demonstrations. They had come so far from the time they first tentatively took that knee and challenged their communities to be better. And that taught me that while many roads may have led us to the summer of 2020, one of them runs straight through the athletic fields of the United States. And that's a story that I wanted to tell.
Dave, thank you very much. Myth of inclusion and reality of exclusion. That's a very, very powerful statement. There is something so pure and simple and powerful in taking a knee. It makes sense. I think of John Carlos, right? And I mean, they did something different. You could have seen this, but I wanted to just, in the chat, I just got a note from Peter Dreyer, and Peter has he's pulled up his 2005 letter in which he introduces us and says the nation should think about having a sports columnist. Hey, so that's how it's a great letter. I wanted to ask you, the Trayvon Martin, I mean, and you talked about George Floyd and the impact, but Trayvon Martin seemed almost like the Emmett Till for this generation, and it also inspired. I mean, it was Colin Kaepernick, but it was also what activist athletes were feeling in their own lives, communities.
I could have called this book The Trayvon Martin Effect very, very easily. It's something that I think those of us who've been doing this a while maybe didn't quite recognize when it happened. I mean, we all recoiled in horror when George Zimmerman not only stalked and killed Trayvon Martin, but also there had to be a massive social struggle just to get George Zimmerman taken into custody. And then, of course, he was found scot-free. It was horrific in 2012 to see this play out. But at the same time, I don't know if we quite realized the scarring effect that this had on a young generation of people. Because imagine being 10 or 11 years old in 2012. That means you're old enough to realize what's happening, old enough to follow the story of Trayvon Martin, but also young enough to ask the question, why does the world even have to be this way? And in that regard, it was very similar, Katrina, to the stories I've heard from civil rights veterans about, and Muhammad Ali, by the way, is one of these folks who, when Emmett Till was brutalized and lynched in Mississippi, it changed something in them when the images of what happened to him appeared in national magazines. And it was something that no matter how many other horrors took place in reaction to the civil rights movement, it was something that they held close to their heart, this idea of Emmett Till. And until we correct a society that would do something like that to Emmett Till, we have a problem. And of course, the people who killed Emmett Till also found scot-free by a jury. And so the similarities to Trayvon Martin are really profound. Also, two other things that you said. This book doesn't even happen without John Carlos from the 1968 Olympics, because the very genesis of this book, the very beginning of it, was me. I wrote John Carlos's memoir with him, and we were just sitting, we become very close. And just a couple years ago, we were sitting around talking, and he looked at me very, very offhandedly and said, after we raised our fists in Mexico City, people started raising their fists at track meets around the country. And I was like, what? I didn't know that. We've been talking for years. I've studied this, backwards and forwards. I didn't know there was like a youth movement of people replicating what you did. And he was like, yeah, it's like very offhand. And I was just like, wow, I wish I could tell that story, but of course it's been 50 years, that story really can't be told. I mean, how would I even begin? But it made me think of the stories I'd written for The Nation, these sort of one-off stories of this high school in Detroit where people threw garbage at kids because they took a knee, or that middle school in Beaumont, Texas, where young kids took a knee and the league offices canceled the entire football league because they took a knee in Texas, of all places, where football is so close to a religion, but in some places clearly white supremacy is more of a religion than football. These were things that I started to think, because of what John Carlos said, we need something holistic that looks at the struggle. And then just the last thing I'll say is, just because you mentioned Peter Dreyer, I just wanted to say how much I love his work, particularly around Curt Flood. I mean, it's to have it in the pages of The Nation is so terrific. For that for me is just catnip when I see Peter Dreyer's name on a byline.
For me too. Dave is the Lester Rodney of the 21st century, what Peter writes. We were just talking about, I wanted one last, so we talked a lot about the NFL as the reproducer of power and property and so-called patriotism. You and I are both big basketball fans.
Mm-hmm.
And the recent NBA news about vaccine hesitancy, to put it mildly, among certain star players, I think about 40, not all of them, has been difficult. How do you think they're gonna, Adam Silver, the NBA head, the league is handling this issue, and do you think the NBA should mandate vaccines?
It's
I mean, it's
Katrina, I might as well tell you this. I've literally been writing about this for the last 3 days, trying to get my column in for The Nation. It's been so hard to get my head around, because one of the things that's so difficult about this issue as well is that some of the leading voices for the NBA to be a voice in the struggle for Black lives have either been silent or very disappointing or anti getting a vaccination. And it's forced me to really reckon with something that, I've known for years, but I've never seen it this concrete. And that's the deep contradiction of being a professional athlete in the United States, is that there is a contradiction at the heart there. And the contradiction is that as an athlete, you absolutely benefit from collective struggle. You benefit from having a union. If you look at what pro sports looked like before there were unions, it was a horror show. So most pro athletes, not all, but most, are very pro-union because of it's their lived reality, their situation, having that union to have their back. But at the same time, while there is quote unquote collective bargaining, these players, they negotiate individual contracts, and spaces for roster spots are incredibly fierce. So it's a union job, but there's also tremendously cutthroat competition and hyper individualism that's required to be able to succeed and survive. And you hear that in the anti-vaccination statements of some of these athletes, like this, not a sense of community, not a sense of broader solidarity. And obviously we shouldn't single NBA athletes in that. I mean, we're seeing that right now in the public sector unions where I live in Montgomery County. And these stances by some, certainly not all unions, is something that I think those of us who see ourselves as progressives need to fight against, and make an argument for community health, and make an argument that getting the vaccine is an act of solidarity, and something that LeBron James, who I give all the credit in the world to for changing the culture of sports, for him to say something like, and this is almost a direct quote, I'm not, because I have the quote written down, it's going to be for the article, but he basically said, this isn't an issue like police brutality or racism. I'm not going to tell other people what to think. And it's like, well, but it kind of is an issue like police brutality and racism, because it's about, there's nothing more central to solidarity than community health. And there's nothing more central to community health than solidarity. And so to me, the NBA, it reflects these broader trends in the United States, e pluribus unum, that tension between us all being one, but also seeing ourselves in this hyper individualistic framework.
Thank you, Dave. That was really powerful. I'm going to turn this over to Aaron. There are lots of questions, as there always are when you come and talk to us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Dave. Thank you for being here. Congratulations on your extraordinary book. I want to let you know that there's lots of love for you in the chat. And I just want to read to you a comment from Joan Einstott writes, it's because of activism by athletes that I even pay attention to sports. Each action or inaction matters. Growing up in the 40s and 50s and knowing of the courage of Jesse Owens for just going to the Olympics was a major example to me. And you, Dave Zirin, keep my interest going because you combine sports with what matters, which is more than the games. So,
I mean, I have to say, I've heard that a lot. Not the compliments to me that I perhaps don't hear so much, but the it's a rough world out there. But what I have heard a great deal is this idea that with this last decade, where the politics of sports have become more central, that there is actually a greater interest among people in terms of following what's happening. And the big newspapers in this country have noticed that as well. This isn't just something, in the corners of the left. This is something very broad in this country. So USA Today now has a very specific position set up, a department around sports and culture. The Washington Post now has 2 dedicated sports writers that just deal with the politics, economics, and culture of sports. And the San Francisco Chronicle does this as well. The New York Times has shifted its famous Sports of the Times column to speaking about these issues more consistently. There is this recognition that sports aren't just sports anymore, that the wine is out of the bottle, and that there is an interest in people in keeping up with these trends.
That leads directly into a question from Jim Guild, and I'm going to paraphrase. With this sea change in how the media is looking at sports and politics, are you finding more avenues for your work? Do you have more outlets to share your views? Do you have more opportunity for your writing?
Well, yes and no. Yes, there's more people reaching out to me to see about writing this op-ed or maybe a book on this, book proposals, things of that nature. But there's also, and I think this is a wonderful thing, is there's also more competition among writers who are trying to cover this ground, which, I was pretty lonely in writing about this stuff for years for The Nation. And that shifted dramatically in the early 2010s. And a whole new generation of writers coming out of journalism school or coming out of the blogosphere started to not, they were, when I'm thinking of people specifically, they're not just people who all of a sudden became political in 2010, 2012. These were people who just thought that their politics had no place in sports writing. And they started to see that loosen up. And it's created just some incredible journalism over the last decade. And the sports journalistic world has broken some of the most important stories that we have about transgender rights, about sexual violence, certainly, about abuse. I'm thinking about the stories of places like Penn State or the U.S. women's gymnastics team. These are not stories that are just sports stories, but at the same time, it was sports journalists who did the initial digging that got some of these stories out there. And I think, specifically when we talk about Black Lives Matter and the professional athlete, it's been journalists who've already had those connections with those athletes who've made the most hay. The most important story of the Colin Kaepernick era, and I write about this in the book, was an NFL Network reporter named Steve Weish, who saw what Kaepernick was doing and intuited that there was a story there. And I think that to me is very fascinating, that Steve Weish with the NFL Network, a network that's owned by the National Football League, his political consciousness was so sharp that he recognized the connection with what Kaepernick was doing with this broader movement.
Thank you. A question from Chuck Carlson. Has the backlash against taking a knee succeeded? I've noticed that at sports events I attend, the national anthem is played before players arrive on the field. Pro soccer as an example. Is this a cop-out? Is it fear of expressing opinion in sports?
Yes, absolutely. Very well identified. There's a book called The Heritage by Howard Bryant, which I always say to folks, if you're going to get one book, please get mine. But if you get 2 books, get The Heritage. by Howard Bryant. And one of the cases that Howard Bryant makes very compellingly is that it was the hyper-patriotism, the steroids of patriotism that were injected into the sports world after 9/11 that led to like partnerships between the Pentagon and the National Football League that insisted that players be out there standing on the sidelines for the national anthem. And this is when players started to say, wait a minute, if I'm being asked to not only support an anthem and a country in the abstract, but also, the war on terror and the entire post 9/11 agenda, which of course has been, utterly discredited over the last several months in terms of that agenda. It's like, then this is a political space, and therefore it's a space that I have the right to assert my own politics in. One of the ways that sports leagues have had to deal with that politicization is by keeping players off the field altogether. But that being said, when you're talking about places that don't have those kinds of expansive locker rooms and hallways, I'm talking about like high school games, men's sports, women's sports, what have you, you do still see athletes taking a knee during the anthem. And I get emailed stories all the time, like since the book came out, of these individual stories where this has taken place and how the communities are responding. I mean, this is an ongoing story because athletes have now been empowered with a language that they didn't have before.
From Mike Dolber, I was very happy to see a spark of activism and protest in Major League Baseball after the George Floyd murder. But in general, it seems like baseball players are the least activist group of pro athletes, except for hockey, at least in regard to societal issues. Do you think that's the case? And if so, why?
Yeah, great question. Baseball is such a contradictory sport with regards to its politics, because it's the sport that gave us Jackie Robinson. It's the sport that gave us Curt Flood. It's the sport that gave us Roberto Clemente. But it's also the sport that overwhelmingly tried to keep Jackie Robinson out. It's also the sport that did not know what it had in Roberto Clemente until he so tragically died trying to deliver such needed emergency food and equipment to Nicaragua that had been just ravaged by an earthquake in the early 70s. And it's, of course, a sport that just tried to destroy Curt Flood for daring to exercise his rights of freedom. And it's a sport that's rooted in these very, very deep traditions, which are often very conservative. In the book, I interview a player for Major League Baseball, the only player who took a knee during this last 5 years, named Bruce Maxwell, a catcher for the Oakland A's, who was he's now back in a farm system, but he found himself without a home. He was playing in Mexico for years, kicking all kinds of butt. I mean, he's a major league talent. And Bruce's story is really, really interesting about what motivated him and also the backlash for when he took that knee. And so baseball last August, I mean, it was that was what really shocked me when you had the sports strike wave last August after the police shooting of Jacob Blake that started in the NBA, spread quickly to the WNBA. And then when it hit Major League Baseball, that's the moment where you could have knocked me over with a feather, because it does have these deep, deep conservative traditions. And it just goes to show you that when you have a big enough movement, that wall can be breached.
We have a question from Peter Dreyer. Can you talk about Sean Doolittle, who, unlike many radical athletes, he's a multi-issue radical justice, workers' rights, LGBTQ rights, pro-veteran, but anti-militarism, feminist, pro-immigrant rights, anti-Trump, etc. He writes, I loved your podcast interview with pitcher Sean Doolittle. He may be the only DSA member among pro athletes. He's been less outspoken this season, perhaps because he's not doing that well on the mound.
Yeah, I mean, Sean Doolittle, when he played for the Washington Nationals, as someone who lives in the DC area, it was just so much fun to have him here, because he and his partner, Aaron, great name there, were people who actually online, I mean, they actually felt like, hey, we have this platform. This platform was earned by Sean. It wasn't just given to him. And so we can use this to advocate for Afghan refugees. I mean, it was anything that hit them in the heart. They were willing to put themselves out there and say, we need a better world, and I'm going to use my major league platform to do it. And I thought Sean has handled himself brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly in that regard. And so, I hope to hear more from Sean in the future, whether he's a pitcher or not, because that mind is too precious. I will say this though about him being more quiet this year. I've heard this from other players. There are players who are either like quiet DSA sympathizers or people who want to see change, and this has been a very difficult year for them. 2021. I mean, there's been throughout sports, but particularly in baseball, this kind of reassertion of hierarchy is what I call it. And after 2020 and all the athletes who spoke out after the police murder of George Floyd, there was this real push to make sure everybody knew their role, knew their place, and just shut up and did their thing. Like, okay, you had your fun in 2020. We're going to run a much tighter ship this year about you speaking out. And this is just at the professional level, to be clear. And I haven't spoken to Sean about this at all, but I wonder if he's felt that too, because the other folks I've spoken with have found that the locker room has been a much less fertile place to speak to their teammates about these issues than it was a year ago.
About your book, how did you go about researching whom to interview for your book? How did you find even some of the obscure athletes that you talked to who had such incredible stories?
This was incredible, Erin, and I don't know if this would pass best practices in terms of academic research, but I started by just putting it out on social media. Like, yo, I am doing this book about athletes who've taken a knee. If you trust me with your story, or if you know someone who would, bring it my way. And so that got me the first several dozen people who wanted to talk, more than that really, who wanted to talk. And then it involved me going online, doing some serious searches for these different stories. Lexus, Nexus, Lexus, all that stuff was super important. Doing that level of research, and then using social media as a way to reach out and speak to them, like, hey, I'm doing this book. And then word sort of got around that I was doing this book, and I was getting unsolicited queries to be involved with the book. So then I had all these interviews, like way too many for a book, and that's when I had to think very seriously about representation in history. Like, for example, it couldn't just be, ooh, these are the stories I like the most. It had to be, okay, women were very central to this movement, therefore women need to be represented in this book. Or, okay, white athletes were part of some of these, but I don't want this to be a story of white athletes. So I have to make sure that, there are some stories in there because it's very interesting, like how as a white athlete do you confront fighting racism? But that can't be something that overwhelms what we're trying to say in the book. I wanted to make sure that there was at least some serious meat, if you will, for the high school, college, and professional section, because I believe very strongly that that's the way the book should be divided, not so much divided by, say, region or sport or gender. Like, I wanted it divided by these stages in these people's lives, because the specific challenges that I found in talking to folks, whether they were a high school, college, or professional athlete, were very different in terms of the backlash and what they had to deal with. So that's how I went about doing the book. It started by taking this massive lump of clay and tons of transcripts, and then figuring out how to turn it into something that could really be something that could help young people, because I want them to be able to read it. And someone joked with me that the book should be called What to Expect When You're Protesting, sort of like What to Expect When You're Expecting, like, because it deals with all these different scenarios. Like, okay, what happens if your coach stabs you in the back? How do you deal with it? What happens if your teammates don't offer you solidarity? How do you deal with it? What do you do if you get a death threat online? How do you deal with it? And so all these scenarios in different cases play out. And I was hoping it could give people a sense of strength and a feeling of solidarity when they're reading these cases.
And how are all these athletes dealing? So that's backlash, maybe not only from the institution, but from the people they're with. I mean, that's very personal. How are they handling it? And have they found solace in being part of your stories?
Yeah, no. I mean, I gotta say, like, that's been, I think, the most rewarding part in this process is I've sent every single person I interviewed a copy of the book with a note saying thank you, and them seeing it contextualized. I mean, I've just gotten a great, terrific response from the folks, and that's very rewarding in and of itself. And also, it's the protests of 2020 gave so many of them a sense of vindication that they were on the right side of history, no matter how much they had to suffer individually for what they did. And even places where They had a terrible response. They might have been drummed out of their school. They might have had to leave their college. I didn't find one person who had regrets. You know, they may have regretted how other people acted towards them, but in terms of their own advocacy, I mean, they just want more for their generation than they currently have. And they're proud of the fact that they were on the front lines in terms of trying to fight for it.
And Major League Sports have reacted. I mean, the NFL has what does their reaction mean? What are the steps they've taken mean? What do the athletes think about this?
I would best describe it as carrot. Oh, excuse me. My computer just moved. I would best describe it as carrot and stick. It's the oldest trick in the book. It's the oldest way that management has dealt with rebellion. I mean, in the 19 teens and in the early 1920s, there was a massive persecution of labor radicals. And at the same time, that's when the modern NFL was really birthed, because they started factory teams as a point of distraction and cohesion that would push people away from unions and strikes, you know, carrot and stick. And you see something similar today. The NFL has put, you know, slogans in the end zones like "End Racism" and "We're all in this together." And, you know, and there are 5 separate decals that are league approved that you're allowed to put on your helmet for games that express messages of, I guess, the most tepid sort of anti-racism. And that's the carrot. You know, also the carrot is them even saying like, hey, stay in the locker room. We're not going to enforce you coming out for the anthem anymore. Like, let's, you know, let's take that off the table, you know, because so many people are objecting to that. The stick is, of course, Colin Kaepernick, still no job. Eric Reed, who I interview in the book, who kneeled with Kaepernick, still no job. The absence of Black executives, franchise owners, coaches, you know, that's the stick really. And I got to say, to hear the athletes themselves talk about it, they tell me that Colin Kaepernick is really used as a kind of a ghost story. And that's how NFL franchise owners define Kaepernick's value, not as a quarterback who can help them win, which he surely could, but as a ghost story to scare a young generation of players into towing the line. Now, fortunately, talking to these players, most of them see Colin Kaepernick as a kind of martyr, as an animating spirit, as somebody whose legacy they want to make live, but it's also used in a way that's very negative and aimed at silencing dissent.
Thank you. Emma Statler would like to know, how's the response been to your book so far? Has it been reviewed in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or other major outlets?
If anybody knows how to get it reviewed in the New York Times, I shall thank you and buy you all the dinners. But the response has been fantastic. The reviews have been terrific. It's, you know, a lot of the thing I've written, as Katrina said, a bunch of other books, and oftentimes they get reviewed with a lot of sort of suspicion, I guess is the word I would use, or condescension, like, oh, sports and politics. Oh, sure. You know, I wrote a book 10 years ago called Game Over, How Politics are turning the sports world upside down. And that got reviewed by some publications of people saying, really? Will politics really turn the sports world upside down? This sounds very fanciful. And then the very next year, you have the Miami Heat posing with hoodies. And I think I even got to include that in the book right before publication. But so I guess skepticism is the best word. And this is the first book I've written that, other than the memoir I did with John Carlos, really, although even that was greeted with skepticism. Like, do we really want a full memoir about someone who raised a fist on the medal stand, even though John Carlos's story is utterly fascinating? So to write a book that's not greeted with skepticism, but greeted more with like, wow, you know, this is real. You know, there really was this movement that wasn't reported on. I mean, that in and of itself has been extremely gratifying. And this is also really the first book where I don't really center my own words, my own personality. Like, it's the stories of the people. They're the voices that are centered. And I think that's also been very appealing to folks.
Thank you. Bob Rosen is in the audience, and he writes, tell Dave that one of his high school teachers is in the webinar and says, keep writing and fighting the good fight. So proud of the work you do. Got
to respond to that real quick. Bob Rosen, an amazing teacher, New York Friends, 16th and 3rd Avenue. Bob Rosen, who he did jazz band, and I'm not a musician, so I didn't know Bob well in high school. But after Magic Johnson announced that he was HIV positive, it was the first time I'd ever spoken publicly in my life because I was such a basketball fan. I stood up in the silent meeting at our Quaker school and I made a speech about what it meant to me to hear that Magic Johnson was HIV positive. And Bob Rosen came up to me afterwards, after that, and said to me, "Hey, you've never really spoken out loud before, have you?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And he looked at me and he gave me a pat on the back and he said, "You should really think about doing it more." And that meant so much to me. Like, it's sometimes like these comments by teachers when you're at that age can be transformative. And so, I mean, Bob Rosen changed my life. I'll say that proudly.
That's a great story. We've talked about activist athletes. Are there such things as activist coaches or general managers, or who are the other people in sports who might be making a difference?
Well, in the book, I talked to a lot of cheerleaders who took a knee, and I think they're sometimes marginalized and ignored. And it's amazing to talk to them. And that's another thing about wanting the book to be representative. Like, cheerleaders made a big impact in terms of taking a knee during the anthem. And so I tell several cheerleader stories in the book, and not so much general managers and coaches. I mean, there's some coaches, Greg Popovich, who I've interviewed for The Nation, Steve Kerr for the Golden State Warriors. You know, they've been powerful advocates in and of themselves. And I think they scared Donald Trump too, because Donald Trump loved nothing more than going after Black athletes who stood for these principles. But when you had two middle-aged and middle-aged plus coaches who are white also speaking out for the importance of Black lives, I think that made, you know, the synapses in Donald Trump's brain short circuit, and he didn't know how to deal with it, which is amusing in and of itself. But you know, you really, I think the cheerleaders are amazing. Like their stories about feeling like they had to take a knee because they're the face and representative of their school, and they wanted the people to know that not everything was all right, that racism was wrong, that people, you know, this isn't a time to just cheer, basically. I mean, that was really impressive to me. It reminded me of like Eartha Kitt at the White House or something, you know, in the 60s, like this idea of saying, you know, okay, you know, culture maybe needs to take a back seat when you're talking about injustice, and we're going to then impose our resistance to injustice on the culture itself.
We have a question from David Kasker, wondering what you think about the fact that more and more athletes are proudly coming out.
I mean, this is, I assume the question is not coming out as protesters, but coming out and being proudly LGBTQ. I think that this is a reflection, once again, of sports being a mirror of the movement itself. And what I find so interesting about this young generation of out athletes is that when you talk to them and they say, well, you know, frankly, I'm not coming out because I was never in. It's something that's very organic. We're starting from a very young age. They're not trying to hide who they are because they're playing sports. You know, sports for decades was called like the last closet. You know, it was a nickname for sports because particularly in men's sports, the idea of having to be secretive about who you were was paramount. And to see the shift in that, to see an NFL player, Carl Nassib, come out and have it be like a non-story, I mean, is really a rather remarkable sign of the times. And it has everything to do. I mean, the same reason why there's an LGBTQ club at my son's junior high school that was started by students is the same reason why it's more accepted in the sports world, because people are coming of age, not having to come out because they were never in.
A question from Sally Jones from Peace Action, New York. Are you going to update People's History of Sports in the United States? It was a wonderful book to catch up on the intersection of sports and social justice. We are really happy to have you at our Peace Action New York award event on Monday evening.
Slipping it in there, very, very nicely done. Yeah, I'm going to introduce the awards recipients, Atan Thomas and Renee Montgomery, two amazing athlete activists in their own right. I'm so excited to be able to do that. If people want more information, my Twitter handle is @EdgeOfSports. I think that's wonderful that New York Peace Action is recognizing this. As for updating a people's history of sports in the United States, I mean, I'm open to talking about it. The DMs are open if any publishers are listening, because it is interesting, like how much it's humbling to go back and look at that book, because I published it like in 2008, 2009, and we have a whole nother book that could be written just because of the last 12, 13 years. It's been so intense. So I'd love to be able to expand it so we can get that full reckoning of this people's history.
Thank you. We have a comment in the chat from Susan Burns, who writes, I have never cared about sports and have certainly never purchased a book by a sports writer. I'm buying this one.
Great. I appreciate that. And I'll just throw out there, and I want folks to know this, that anything I earn from this book is going to an organization called Serve Your City DC, which is a mutual aid group that works with kids. And the reason for that is it's not that I don't need the money, because I do, but it's because I didn't want to profit from the courage of the young people whom I interviewed. I wanted to pay it forward, because they didn't profit from their courage. They suffered from their courage. So I'm passing the money on to this amazing mutual aid group that works with kids. And something Serve Your City did, which is one of the things that made the people I interviewed so incredibly happy and joyous, is they purchased 500 copies of the book and put one in each of 500 back to school backpacks to give to young people in DC.
I made a mistake and I paraphrased Jim Gild's question earlier. And I want to re-ask part of it. When he asked now about selling on Amazon and bookstores, has it been easier for you to sell your books via Amazon, et cetera, than through bookstores when they existed, which might not have even stocked your earlier books?
An interesting question. That's an interesting question, because I've never done this before, the other books I've published, but I've been very, very aggressive and very, very public that people should not buy the book from Amazon, and instead look towards an organization called bookshop.org and order from there, because bookshop.org draws all of its stock from independent bookstores. And I don't know about folks out there, but during the pandemic, I missed independent bookstores so much. I seek them out. If I'm in a town like touring or working, I am going to the local independent bookstore. I took my whole family earlier this summer to Powell's in Portland. We flew all the way across the country because they'd never seen Powell's, and I wanted them to see it and see what an independent bookstore could look like. So please, go to bookshop.org so you can support independent bookstores and not support Jeffrey Bezos's phallic aspirations to go into space.
Question from Brenda Belton. I just admire how you were so open and honest in your journalism. What could we, the public, do to help with the causes that you advocate?
I mean, I really think searching out for opportunities to exercise solidarity. I mean, I feel like this young generation, and my daughter's 17, so I have a front row seat to it all the time. They really are more diverse and less tolerant of intolerance than any generation in the history of the United States. I feel like sometimes also, though, we're asking them to carry one heck of a heavy burden, almost like a please save us from Generation McConnell and get us to a better place than we're currently at. And that's a heck of a burden. And so, like, looking for ways as they exercise their own activism that we can offer our own solidarity and support. Sometimes it might be as simple as, if they're taking a knee on the sideline of a game, we do the same in the stands, or we applaud them for doing so. That can be a very simple, basic act of solidarity. Sometimes it could be as simple as putting out a message on social media, because trust me, a lot of these athletes, they're searching their names because there's a lot of downtime. And so just offering some form of support, supporting organizations that do this kind of work is very important. I mentioned Serve Your City as one example, but just look for groups that are really trying to strengthen this young generation, because I think they're going to shake up the world and we should help them.
We have just a few minutes left before I turn it over to Katrina. I want to quickly tell you that this talk has gone international. We have someone from Uzbekistan signed on, and also in the US, Colorado, California, Pennsylvania, Texas, New York, Washington, Michigan, Wisconsin. I'm sure I missed something. I apologize if I didn't shout your state out. And was there a particular story in your book that you can share that really gives you hope?
Yeah. First of all, to our Uzbeki comrade, hello. And I want to just share one story that means so much to me in the book. They all mean a lot to me, but the story of Garfield High School is just really inspiring. It's in Seattle. Seattle, of course, is a very liberal city. Garfield's an amazing public high school. It's where Jimi Hendrix went to high school. It's where Quincy Jones went to high school. And there were some very disturbing instances of police violence and police killings in Seattle. And so a couple of members of the football team said they were going to take a knee. And their coach, Joey Thomas, really one of those kinds of transformational coaches you hope you get once in your life, decided to make it a team issue. And they all talked together as a team and decided to do it together. And that inspired the softball team to do the same. That inspired the women's soccer team to do the same. And they paid a terrible price for it. Joey Thomas got the tires of his car slashed. Death threats came into the school. Joey Thomas was forced out of his job for being this incredible transformational coach. So the price was paid, but not only the absence of regret, but the fact that all these athletes have now taken their activism the next step and feel fortified by the experience. I mean, to me is something, I mean, they've started their own organizations in the school that you don't have to be an athlete to belong to. And to me, that is what this is all about. It's about understanding that these instances of heroism are not only confined to the athletic field, but they have this chain reaction or effect that has altered entire communities.
Thank you. Before I turn it back to Katrina, Dave, I want to say thank you. I look forward to seeing you in Florida when our community will gather. If anybody's interested, it's going to be the nation's first cruise on land at Club Med in Sandpiper Bay from December 3rd through the 7th. And I'm excited to see you there. And with that, I will turn it over to Katrina.
Yeah, and if you're interested to spend more time with the riveting Dave Zirin, it's thenation.com/events for info. I want to thank Bob Rosen, your high school teacher, Dave, for suggesting you continue to speak and speak out as you have so brilliantly over these last years. I want to thank Peter Dreyer for introducing us in 2005. I want to thank you for your what you bring in terms of sports history. You talked about Howard Zinn. I think of our longtime correspondent Gore Vidal, who talked about the US of amnesia. Yeah. And I think the history, people standing on other shoulders, as you have other journalists. But thank you for your passion, and thank you for your wisdom about solidarity and COVID. That was really interesting, the entire conversation. And I hope that those on the call also understand that the nation has not only been covering the movements through Dave and others, but oxygenating with ideas. And I think covering movements leads in a great way to more movements because they see themselves. And yeah. I'm, proud that the nation.com now is 22 to 34. That's demographic. But Dave has been a big measure of that. And I think bringing a new readership to the nation. So I'm grateful for that. I look forward to seeing you soon. Stay strong. Don't do too many Zooms. I'm glad everyone should buy at bookshop.org. We support independent bookstores. My daughter spent about 5 hours in Powell's this past summer. So I know what you're saying. Anyway, thank you all for joining, and thank you so much, Dave. Thank you, Aaron and Peter and Sarah and Gia and everyone.